Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 3 on Federalism. Today we'll be talking about different governmental structures, unitary, confederal, and federal systems, and the pros and cons of each. We'll be looking at the differences between state and national governmental powers, applying the lens of same-sex marriage legalization. And we'll also do a little bit on the different types of federalism throughout history, dual federalism versus cooperative federalism, and then the role of the Supreme Court as the arbiter between the lines. The two most prevalent governmental systems in the world are unitary and federal, and most countries actually have the unitary system, as you'll see there in blue. There are really no confederal systems left. Countries like France, Great Britain, the Philippines, Ghana, Israel, Japan, and Sweden have the unitary system. And within this system, ultimate authority is in the hands of the central government. All of the local municipalities and departments, they do have jurisdiction over certain things, but only what is given to them by the central government. They are under the national government. And the national government could overrule lower levels of government. So any kind of decision on education, police, welfare is handled by the national government. And in my physical classrooms, we usually try to draw what this unitary system would look like. If you needed to draw it, if you needed to make an infographic trying to illustrate the relationship between the local and the national government, what would it look like? Well, it would likely look like something like this, right? You'd have a pretty big, sizable central government, and then you'd be drawing these arrows of power down to the state or local levels, right? Because all power emanates from the federal government, right? Okay, then you have the confederal system, a great example being the Articles of Confederation, right? What is this system like? Well, the confederal system is exactly the opposite of a unitary system, right? It's a league of independent states that gives the central government only some power for specific matters. So which retains the most amount of power? Right, the states. Like I mentioned earlier, there are no real confederations left. Some aspects of the European Union could be called confederal. Other people may disagree about this. Basically, in a nutshell, the member states of the EU give the governing bodies some power, for instance, over financial and security issues, right? They have sort of a collective security apparatus. But the states do retain almost all of their sovereignty, right? France is still France. Germany is still Germany. There are also some common economic policies. There is a single economic market. There's open borders in particular areas. And in most EU member countries, there's a common currency, right? The euro. France no longer uses the franc, right? And in the Schengen area, you have the euro. I would say the EU is kind of a tweener. It's almost between confederal and federal. But anyway, there are no technical confederal systems left on the globe. So now thinking again, if we wanted to get creative and draw a confederal system, what would it look like? You would make the state governments bigger, right? Unlike this, where these look kind of the same size as unitary. Well, maybe not quite so much, but the state is bigger, right? And the central government would be a lot smaller. I guess you do see a difference here in size. And where are the arrows of power going? From the states to the central government, right? The state is where power emanates from. The federal government only has the power that the states give it, right? Okay, so what is the federal system like? Well, the federal system is in between these two other systems, right? You have authority divided between the national government, the federal government, and the regional governments of the states, right? They have their own spheres of authority, and within each of these spheres, they are supreme. The US has had an evolution in terms of the powers of the federal and the state government, which we will talk about in a couple of slides. But again, how would we illustrate this? You would have not a huge federal government or not huge, state governments, right? They're kind of somewhat equal, with the federal government being slightly larger, right? Because we have the supremacy clause. We'll learn about that in a couple of slides. And the power arrows are kind of going both ways, right? There are aspects wherein the federal government has more power, and then there's other ones where the states can retain some of their authority. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits and drawbacks for the federal system. And of course, there's benefits and drawbacks for all three of those systems, but since this is American government, we'll focus on the federal system. So historically speaking, the federal system was a compromise. Do you remember last chapter? We talked about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? One group wanted a strong central government, the other one wanted a weak central government. Well, the U.S. system allowed for a strong national government, but with continued state governmental power, right? So a strong national government that could handle big issues like national security, which potentially needs quick action and sort of a top-down view, but there's also local power retained by the states so that they could deal with maybe more specific issues that are unique to certain states, like different economic issues like agriculture or the cost of living in certain places, right? So it started as a compromise, right? Another reason that federalism was chosen because of the sheer size of the country. Even when it was just the 13 colonies, it was bigger than France or England, right? And, it's the 1800s, travel is slow, and having a unitary government that only gave power to the national government would actually not be super practical. It would be really hard to govern if it takes weeks to get information to the people about a new law or enforcing something, right? So it began as a compromise. It is more practical, even today, even more so today, right? We have a much larger country. There's also aspects in which it's more effective, right? There was a large population, and of course today as well, so federalism brought government to the people. And it also allows the people to have more participation, right? They can influence policies and governmental agencies within their own communities and states, right? Not necessarily just at the national level. So they don't have to be passive consumers of government, right? But actual participants. How are the state governments like laboratories? Your book talks about this a little bit. For instance, unemployment compensation actually started in Wisconsin. Different air pollution environmental policies started in California, and then both of these went national. So sometimes you see different policies being tested on a smaller scale, right? In one city or in a state, right? And then if they work, they could be considered for the national level. This doesn't happen super often, but even if something doesn't get applied nationally, other states can adopt different policies or approaches that they can see working in neighboring states, right, or other states. So we have some pros here, right, but we also have some potential cons, right, some drawbacks to the federal system. Well, because there are local powers in addition to the strong national government, there are times where local interests block progress and they impede national plans. This is the argument that James Madison actually put forth, right? Especially in Federalist Paper number 10. Factions, right? People working towards their own interests, right? Or even states working for their own interests that aren't necessarily in the interest of the entire population. So in some cases, it's not necessarily a cooperative system, but actually more of a rivalry or a competition. Where political games are played both at the national and state levels. And an example of this impeding of progress is some states resisting equal rights for minority groups. We're going to talk more about this in the Civil Rights chapter, chapter 5. But in a federal system, there is a difference in the consistency of adherence to laws among different states, right? Different laws being enforced in different ways, whether you're in Mississippi or Idaho or California. This is sometimes just a facet of the system's structure. Since the states do have more rights and more power, they do have the ability to deviate a bit from the national goals and policies. And there are actually some differences in state laws that are actually opposing or actually different from federal laws. We'll talk about this in a couple of slides. But in other cases, you see this being very bad, right? One of the biggest issues with segregation and desegregation was that certain states just refused to do it. And it's very difficult to enforce laws sometimes equally and consistently among all of the states. So again, we'll see more of this in chapter 5, but I wanted to bring that up. So there are different powers given to the national government and the state government. Let's look at these and understand the differences. So the powers of the national government are divided among 3 kinds of power: enumerated, implied, and inherent. See those on the sides, right? Enumerated means that they are expressly granted by the Constitution. And some of these are coining money, setting standards for weights and measures, making uniform naturalization laws, admitting new states, establishing post offices, and declaring war. These are powers granted directly to the national government. They are enumerated expressly in the Constitution. Okay? Then you have implied powers, right? Or what is called the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause. This gives Congress the ability to do what is necessary and proper to execute its powers. Oops, sorry about that. It does offer some flexibility, right? So it's elastic. These are not set in stone or expressly written in the Constitution, partially because it's impossible to call out every single power that the national government has or could have in the future. But this clause allows the government to expand to deal with problems, right, that the framers might not have anticipated, especially as they related to the enumerated powers. Basically, this means that the federal government can make any laws that it needs in order to carry out these powers, right? Obviously, in this day and age, with the internet, right, with different forms of communication, some of these might change slightly, right? The way we coin money or something. So let me give you an example. What does the internet, interstellar travel, endangered species, like the eagle here, and toasters have in common? What do these 4 have in common? They're not just a random collection of photos. This elastic clause that we have here allows the government to make laws in reference to these, right? They did not have endangered species back in the time of the founding fathers. They didn't have toasters, right? Obviously, they didn't have the internet. There was no ability for space travel. So this implied power allows the government to be able to make laws in reference to these, right? Laws for the internet, laws that set apart funding for endangered species policies and all that stuff, right? Laws that grant safety for consumers, right? In terms of toasters, in terms of, electrical standards, all this kind of stuff, right? That is all part of the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. It's the same thing. Okay, then we have the last power here is inherent, the last type of national power. Only the government can deal with these powers. Only the government can do this stuff. And it's generally foreign policy. So only the national government deals with other countries. Only the national government can wage war, make treaties, seek trade, right? Florida or Illinois is not going to go make a treaty with France. That is not the powers of the state government. That is only for the national government. All right, so then we have the powers of state government here, right? The powers of the state government are actually spelled out and delineated by the 10th Amendment. What does that say? Well, it says the powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, which are not expressly prohibited to the states, right, are reserved to the states and the people. So whatever power the Constitution doesn't give to the national government goes to the states and the people. And these are called reserved powers. Power that is reserved to the states, right? These are not actually expressly written down either. So sometimes there is an argument over what should be given to the national government or what should be given to the state government, right? We may see a bit of conflict between the elastic clause and the reserved power. But examples of these, for instance, are the regulation of commerce in their own borders. So Indiana regulates commerce within Indiana, California within California, etc. Each state designates its own sales tax, right? They have the power to maintain a state militia and what's called police power, right? This is the legislation of laws governing crime, marriage, education, contracts, land use, etc. It's well within the sort of state context, right? Then we have prohibited powers, right? This is the prohibited delineation here. The Constitution actually prohibits states from some powers, for instance, entering into a treaty with another country. Like I mentioned earlier, Florida cannot decide all of a sudden to have a treaty with Sweden. That is a prohibited power, right? That is not something that the states can do. And the last one here is concurrent. In some cases, the state does share concurrent powers with the federal government. What does concurrent mean? Joint or shared at the same time, right? And these are mostly implied. They aren't expressly mentioned in the Constitution. An example of this is the power to tax, right? So the national government and the state government share this ability. They can't tax each other, but you do have, right, state tax and federal tax. There's also concurrent courts. We're going to learn in the judiciary chapter that there's state courts and there's federal courts, right? They do have different jurisdictions, but they do work together, right? Same with taxes. And I have to highlight this supremacy clause. I kind of mentioned it when we were looking at the drawing of the federal government system. But we have this supremacy clause. And what does that mean? Well, the supremacy of the federal laws over state laws. Basically, states cannot thwart national policies overall. If there is a federal law, the states have to follow it. For example, in the next slide, we're going to look at same-sex marriage, right? It was legalized by the Supreme Court, right? Same-sex marriage has become federal law. The states cannot just say, actually, no, we disagree. We don't want to do that. That is not an option on the table. Every single state has to comply with federal law. And this is because of this supremacy clause. Now, there are some complexities here, some deviations that are allowed, which we will talk about in a couple of slides, but on the whole, states have to fall in line, right? There is a supremacy of national laws over state laws. So since I mentioned it, let's talk about it a little bit. A recent law, right, last summer, that demonstrates the supremacy clause, the supremacy of national laws over state laws. Looking here at same-sex marriage. So let's just get some background. So DOMA, or the Defense of Marriage Act, defined marriage as between a man and a woman. It decided that states can ban same-sex marriage and can also refuse to recognize same-sex marriages granted by other states. It also barred same-sex spouses from receiving federal benefits, for example, insurance benefits or joint tax returns, Social Security, survivor benefits, etc. And this was signed into law in 1996. So here we're going to see this whole evolution, right, of all these differences, of all these different state laws, and then what happened actually when the federal law was made, right? So in 2003, Massachusetts is the first state to determine that its state constitution does not deny same-sex marriage rights, and it was actually rather unconstitutional under the Massachusetts state constitution to allow only opposite-sex couples to marry. So they had to extend it, based on their constitution, they had to extend it to all people, right? All Americans. Or not all Americans, but all Massachusetts residents, right? So gay marriage was legalized in Massachusetts in 2004. The next 7 years, you see some states banning gay marriage and others legalizing it. Proposition 8 was a really big ruling, pretty famous, that made same-sex marriage illegal in California in 2008. But then a couple years later, in 2010, it was overturned and determined to be unconstitutional. 2013 was a pretty big year for gay rights. A monumental ruling actually declared a portion of DOMA unconstitutional. This section that was deemed unconstitutional was in reference to federal benefits. So after this ruling, committed same-sex couples who are legally married in their own states, in the states that allow it, can receive federal protections, right? So any kind of Social Security, veterans benefits, health insurance, all that good stuff. And so this is actually the beginning of the end for the same-sex marriage bans. By 2014, a series of federal court decisions struck down same-sex marriage bans in several states, and by 2015, a year later, the Supreme Court rules in Obergefell versus Hodges that all bans on same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. So gay and lesbian couples can now marry legally in all 50 states, right? That is, this federal ruling becomes the law of the land in every single state. So you had this question throughout those years, right? Basically from 1996 up until the very beginning of 2015, and throughout 2015 actually. This question: does the ruling of the federal government regarding same-sex marriage denigrate states' rights? What is the relationship here? Who's got the power to designate the legality of certain marriages? And there's two sides, right? So Jason Kuznitsky from the Cato Institute actually says marriage should be left to the states. The 10th Amendment states the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. And then he argues marriage is not commerce, war, or taxation. It is unrelated to money, the post office, the patent system, or any of the other enumerated powers of the federal government. Its regulation is neither necessary nor proper in pursuit of those powers. And hopefully because of all this reading and studying we've done, we can pick up a lot of those powers that we learned about within his position. But then we have Ian Millhiser from the Center for American Progress on the other side saying, no, this does not denigrate states' rights. And he says, there are difficult questions in constitutional law. This is not one of them. The Constitution provides that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And last time I checked, gay men and lesbians are people. So we're having the argument here from the 14th Amendment, right? That everyone should have equal protection of the laws, no matter what state they live in, right? Then he continues, moreover, LGBT Americans possess all the traits the Supreme Court identified as requiring heightened protection from discrimination. States are not allowed to defy the Constitution, period. So like I said, there was a lot of debate about the legalization of same-sex marriage. But the Supreme Court made the final ruling. It decided that the same-sex marriage does not denigrate states' rights, and rather, following kind of what Ian Millhiser was arguing, it rather upholds the liberty and the freedom of gay Americans. So you cannot disenfranchise one group of people at the expense of another, right? For example, you cannot allow heterosexual Americans to marry and then who get all these tax benefits and other social, financial, psychological benefits from marriage, and then not allow homosexual Americans the exact same thing. It actually is unconstitutional. You're not allowing for the same treatment of all people and equal rights for all people, regardless of where they live. I think we'll be talking about this in a couple of chapters, in particular, the 14th Amendment. So it's important to remember the Supreme Court is the final arbiter when it comes to these questions, when it comes to figuring out what is in the power of the federal government and what's in the power of the states. And this changed throughout the years, actually. Though the Civil War put an end to the debate of slavery, it didn't actually put an end to the debate over the division of power between the federal and the state governments. And the model of federalism that followed during this time period was called dual federalism. And this emphasized a distinction between national and state government spheres of authority. And your book describes this as a layer cake, right? So you see these separate spheres of influence, right? Co-equal, but neither is interfering in each other's business. You have very specific boundaries and very clear boundaries, right? After the Civil War, there was a revival of state rights, and the Supreme Court put limits on Congress to legislate what it called local matters. So this was the case from about after the Civil War till 1929. And what happens in 1929? Yes, indeed, we have the crash of the stock market, right? In the 30s, the U.S. was under the Great Depression, right? Thousands of banks are failing, businesses are failing. 25% of the labor force was unemployed at the height. That's a lot of people. The public wanted the government to help, right? So Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, was elected president, and he intervened in the economy with what was called the New Deal. These really large scale anti-poverty programs and economic regulations. Some of these included Social Security, which helped disabled and elderly people, a program that we still have. There was regulation of the stock market to stave off future crashes. And the Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, which made housing more affordable, at least theoretically. And so you have this expansion of the national government, and it actually continues into the 1970s. As we'll learn in Chapter 5, the 1960s was the Civil Rights Movement, right? And the national government was very instrumental in extending rights like voting to African Americans. So it does become a bit bigger. And as you can see from this piece of cake, there is a sort of kind of integration, right? It's a little bit more integrated. You have a bit more of the federal government within the states and a little bit more of the states within the local. Much different from these kind of very straight and limited spheres of authority here, right? So like a pendulum, there is a balancing and a kind of a change, an oscillation between federal and state power. And like I said, this changes throughout history. And at times, it seems like there is a favoring of federal power, and then there's instances wherein the federal government is actually limited in exchange for states' rights. And as I mentioned earlier, the arbiter of these constitutional issues and the major player in determining where this line is drawn, right, the lines between the cake, you can almost say, is the Supreme Court, right? As we saw in the New Deal in the 1930s and throughout the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, there is an expansion of federal power. Conversely, in the 1990s, you have examples of the courts ruling actually in favor of the states. For example, the Gun-Free School Zones Act in 1990. This actually tried to ban the possession of guns within 1,000 feet of any school, and that was declared unconstitutional. It was decided that this was outside of the purview of the federal government. It has nothing to do with commerce or economics, so it was ruled like not relevant, right? And it did not pass. And of course, that's positive or negative depending on what side of the fence you're on. Of course, when it comes to gun control, it's an understatement to say that this is a very controversial topic. Another example, though it's illegal in any other states, it is legal for patients in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont with terminal illnesses to choose to end their lives with medical assistance to avoid suffering. These laws allow mentally competent, terminally ill adult state residents to voluntarily request and receive a prescription medication to hasten their death. So these were passed and these were allowed. Another example of how state laws can be different, actually, than the federal laws. This death with dignity law is only allowed in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont. There might have been changes in the last couple of years, but it's just within these states that this is legal. Another example, it's legal with some restriction to smoke marijuana or consume edibles for medical or recreational purposes in Colorado and within a couple other states. Adults 21 or older can legally possess 1 ounce of weed. There are 23 states who have medical marijuana laws that allow people to consume it for medical reasons, right? It's safer than painkillers. It lessens nausea from chemotherapy. And actually, interestingly, it's been shown to lessen the frequency of certain seizures. So like I said, in these states, marijuana in certain cases is legal, right? Unlike the rest of the U.S., right? So thinking about some of these laws and how they're different from the laws in most other states, can you see any potential conflicts? For example, how could the legalization of pot in Colorado affect its neighbor Utah or Nebraska? Do you think there would be a sort of increase in drug trafficking? You're going to be writing about this in your response paper. I included a link to an opinion piece by Zach Belitho if you want to read his opinion, but I wanted you to specifically respond to his quote. And again, you can see this in the response paper and discussion post. If states are free to disregard federal laws they don't like, then our entire governmental structure is at risk. What's next? That's from Zach Belitho. And I want you to consider his statement. Do you agree? Why? In what ways do different state laws actually strengthen federalism, right? How does it keep states state power, and how does it kind of check national power? But are there some negatives, right? In what ways do state borders get compromised? Is it a true application of equality if you can do something in one state and not the other? So someone goes to jail for smoking weed in Alabama, but someone in Colorado can do it, with no repercussions, right? Is that fair? So let's consider all angles here in our response papers and our discussions. I'll link a couple of different articles with some different positions to kind of give you some ideas. So this is where we're going to end. Go ahead and now you're ready for your quiz. You're ready to do some excellent responding in your papers and your discussion posts. As always, any questions, please don't hesitate.